I'll talk about the law of karma. And there are two very important concepts that are to be understood. The one concept is that of the free will, and the other concept is that of the mind as a stream of consciousness. The law of karma is about causality, about the relation there is between a cause and a result from that cause. Karma means action or doing. At the time of the Buddha, a very dominant karma conception was the one you find in the Upanishad. And it goes something like this, that there is an action, and there's a doer of the action, and there's a result of the action, and there's someone who reaps the result of the action. And the doer and the reaper are the same, namely the Atman, this self, this eternal self, something not only transcendental but something immanent in the conscious experience. It is a wise idea, but from a Buddhist point of view, rather superficial. Because, as you already know, in the Buddhist teaching, there's no unchanging mind, there's nothing unchanging in the mind. When the Buddha talks about no self, he really negates this Atman idea. It's really with reference to this Atman idea. There were many speculations about the soul, and one way of the Buddha to deal with all this was just to negate the very idea. It's all speculation, he says. Look into your mind, as Munindra-ji later paraphrased it, look into your mind and see what you find there. Well, you find this stream of consciousness, vijnana sota, stream of consciousness. From the point of view of the stream, we'll see that there's no unchanging entity that travels between the cause and the effect, so to speak. There's just the fluctuation of consciousness and matter for that sake as well. The law of karma is a psychological law. And I'll give you an example of it, both to illustrate what is doing and what is consequence. So one day, not so long ago, when I walked down the street in Copenhagen, I saw my old friend Robert on the other side of the street. And I waved, and he looked at me, but ignored me completely, and just passed by. And I felt so hurt. I felt abandoned, unlovable, sad, and then angry. I was just about to shout at him. Mm-hmm. And then I discovered that was not Robert. Complete stranger. All what I experienced in the receptivity of my perceptual process, that whole filter through which I had this experience of someone who was not responding to my greeting, that was the consequence of my past actions, accumulated somewhere in my mind, in my subconscious, or in my long-term memory, my cognitive long-term memory. But of course, it was not coincidental that all these emotions arose right in that context. I mean, the guy over there, he was circumstantial. He was like a supportive condition for the maturing of this karma fruit I was experiencing. Had he not been there, and had he not mistaken him for being Robert, then all those emotions had not surfaced to my mind. But a very important point is now that even if it had been Robert, and he had ignored me, my old friend Robert, he had ignored me, and I had reacted the same way, I had felt in the same way, that had nothing to do with Robert. It's the fruit of my karma. He would still just have been circumstantial, a supportive condition, not a karma condition, but just a circumstantial condition for the crystallization of these emotions in the receptivity of my perception. Usually we don't understand it like that. Let's say that Robert was Robert and he ignored me, and I would of course have condemned him for all my negative emotionality. I would have projected them onto him, that he was the cause of them. In order to deepen this understanding, let's look at the Buddhist idea of the perceptual process. It is outlined time and again in the discourses of the Buddha, but in a rudimentary form, and it is developed into a very consistent concept of a process of perception, a consciousness process, as it's called Chitta Vritti in the post-canonical literature. There are 17 moments of consciousness in this process. And at that time, in just a moment, you see a lighting on the sky. There are millions of these processes going on in the perception of just one object. Just as an illustration of the dynamic of the stream. But perception works that way. In order to have a clear perception of something, you have to repeat the act of perception. There's a whole stream of perceptions. This is from a modern neuroscientific point of view, and also from a Buddhistic. So there are many processes in the perception of one object. But each moment of consciousness consists of some aggregates. And an aggregate is just the opposite of a substance. An aggregate is something which depends on something else. Everything is bound together and depends on everything else. Just the opposite of a substance, which is something autonomous, something which is identical with itself all the time, something which is not relativized by anything. And the important thing about the process of perception is that the beginning phase is the receptive phase. And that is the fruit of past actions. Like when I thought I saw Robert, I had all these difficult meanings that arose, the difficult emotions in me. That took place in the receptivity of the process of perception. And I had no influence on it. We don't have any influence on the receptive phase of perception. See if you can avoid listening to this. Could you? No, you were subjected to it. You have no choice. And everything we take in is something that happens to us. And especially it's very difficult to close our ears. We can, to a certain extent, avoid seeing what we don't want to see, but the prerequisite is that we first actually see it, and then we can move our eyes away. But it's very difficult to move our ears away from a sound. And it goes for the other perceptual processes as well. You bite in a sour apple, you're subjected to experience this taste impression. You can put away the apple, then that's another matter. What most people understand to a lesser degree is that a part of our mental life, our inner mental life, is just exactly the same. There's a receptive part, we have no influence on that. Thoughts surface and they happen to us. Not all thoughts, but these karma fruit thoughts. These thoughts of past perceptual processes. They happen to us. In modern psychology, they're called automated thinking. Thoughts that think, that so to speak, think themselves. We don't intend to think them, they just appear. And when they're difficult ones, they usually appear when we are under pressure. And then we perceive the difficult situation we're in through the filter of previous difficult situations by way of this automated thinking. And the Buddhistic way of understanding this is that these filters are fruits or results of past actions or past perceptual processes. From the point of view of modern science, the receptive phase is actually unconscious. It consists of electrochemical messages which associate, among other things, to our emotional memory, the amygdala, and also to our biographical memory. So the reception of an impression is already associated to a lot of information from our past before it actually becomes conscious in our neocortex. And from Buddhist point of view, the doing phase is karma, and it is in this phase that the will is free, because obviously the will is not 100% free. It's not free to the extent that we can avoid the result of past actions. We don't exercise that kind of sovereignty over ourselves. But the important point is that it is sufficiently free to avoid reacting automatically to what is happening to us. It is sufficiently free to do something else than what the receptive phase, so to speak, dictates us. Unwholesome impression dictates us to react with condemnation. And that's a standard reaction. So this we do when we get involved with an unpleasant thought, we condemn it and so on, instead of stepping outside the involvement with the thought and seeing the thought as just a thought, perhaps seeing the variability of the thought, perhaps even having caught the rising phase of the thought, and letting go of our reactivity. This takes place in the proactive phase, or in the karma phase of the perceptual process. So there is the receptive phase, the karma fruit phase. We are subjected to experience that. And then there is the proactive phase, or the active phase, the karma phase, where we're doing something. In the first phase, things are happening to us. In the second phase, we're doing something to what is happening to us. And the free will has a scope here. And one of the reasons why this consciousness process was developed was to explain the freedom of the will. So you see, at the very beginning of the karma phase, according to this Chitta Vritti, there is one moment of consciousness that is karmically inoperative or infunctional. That is, it is ethically unconditioned. And it has a function to decide upon a course of action in face of what is coming in to the receptive phase. And that is, with the reference to your experience in your meditation, the feeling tone, that is the taste of the receptive perceptual process. But then, you don't have to react, you don't have to condemn, you don't have to cling. If you do, that's your free will, if you do. But if you want to liberate your mind, you should be very mindful and not cling and not condemn, because that is within your scope. The more mindful you are, the better you'll succeed in this. The whole summing up of that process is karma bhava, the becoming of karma, or creation of karma. And it is accumulated. Very often there's a result of it in just the preceding perceptual process. But there are also results of karma we may reap long time afterwards. Years afterwards, decades afterwards, even in later lives in principle. And usually there are many results from one action. Depends on the intensity of the action. And what is important in the karma phase, the most important factor, that is cetana, volition. It is so important that the Buddha says, cetana, that I call karma, volition, that I call karma. And this cetana is free in the proactive or in the karma phase. It also arises in the receptive phase, but then it's no longer free. It coordinates, arising factors in accordance with the past karma. It's either conditioned by the past, or it is conditioning according to what you're doing right now. Volition, that is this impulse you feel just before reaching out for the glass of water. The impulsion to do it. You could verbalize that volition, now I'll reach out for the glass of water. It's a more deliberate, volitional activity. And you could sit down and make a whole philosophy of it. Before you came here, most of you have reflected intensively on your intention to come here, and you've had this strong wish to come and meditate and liberate your mind, this Dharma chanta. So there are various levels of intensities of volition. And the basic level is just this impulse, and then there's the verbalized version of it, and then there's the more deliberate and reflected version of it. And of course, the more intense it is, the more powerful action it initiates. But this first moment of consciousness in the face of the experience of feeling tone is free. It's called determining consciousness. And it's ethically unconditioned, it's ethically free. All other factors are either wholesome or unwholesome. But this one is not, it's free. And of course, if the will was not free, if the will was predetermined by the past, as some philosophers actually thought at the Buddha's time, it would be pointless to meditate, it would be pointless to try to liberate the mind. Why put forth effort when everything is determined by past action? In the Abhidharma, the stream of consciousness is analyzed from the point of view of the 24 conditions, pachaya, conditions, dependencies, or relations. One condition is karma condition, or karmic relation, and the other one is a karma fruit relation. And the rest of them are more or less, roughly speaking, more or less, are they just supportive conditions that support either the ripening of karma fruit as the consequences of past action, as in this example with my friend Robert. Robert was a supportive condition for the maturing of some result from my past doing, by which I have developed this thought pattern of being somebody everybody abandons because I'm unlovable, somebody who's always alone, and somebody who cannot help it. A very depressive kind of way of thinking, which many people actually, in one version or another, develop throughout the years. You have to take many years to develop such a thought pattern, and it is stored somewhere in the long-term memory. And when we come under pressure at surfaces, or the stressful situation associates to it. In the situation with Robert, I'm not conscious of these meanings, but I'm very conscious of the emotions they bring to my mind. Maybe I wouldn't have been able to identify the exact nature of my emotions, but I was 100% aware of the displeasure of those emotions, of the feeling tone. It's quite easy to detect the feeling tone when something important is happening, whether it's pleasurable or whether it's displeasurable. So there are all these supportive conditions, and in this case, Robert was his being there, my visual perception of him, initial visual perception, was a supportive condition for bringing about the fruit of my past karma. Supportive conditions are like climatic changes, and what climatic changes and water and sun is to the seed in the ground. You know, the climate, the sun, the water is not the seed, but are prerequisites for the seed to sprout. The seed is a karma, and the plant is a fruit of the karma, and then there are all these supportive conditions, without which the seed would not sprout. So supportive conditions can also be in our inner mind. You know, now, I won't go into details into these 24 relations or conditions, but it's pretty subtle, and it's actually the first example in the history of ideas on consequential process thinking, as it is called, you know, as opposed to substantial thinking. Very modern, this constructivist way of thinking. This system is to illustrate and bring home the point that there's nothing unchangeable in phenomena or in consciousness. Everything depends on everything else. And of course, the wonderful thing about the free will is that all these factors we're dealing with can be developed. We can choose the wholesome things and develop them. The stream is in principle the same from one moment of consciousness to the preceding moment, as from one life to the preceding life. It's in principle the same streaming on of consciousness. One of the functions of consciousness is to turn towards the preceding, to link up with what is coming. And at the moment of death, that is what consciousness does. It sort of goes ahead and links up with the next moment of consciousness, which is in another life. I won't go into details with this, but I'll tell you and show you a story to illustrate the purity of the stream. And it's a story from a wonderful book called The Questions of King Milinda. King Milinda was a Greek king living in Bactria in present-day Afghanistan, one of the provinces founded by Alexander the Great, who went out to India. A monk named Nagasena was thought to be able to teach the king, and he was called to the court. And this book is about all the questions the king asked Nagasena. Nagasena, he succeeds every time in satisfying the king with a compelling answer. The situation I'll illustrate for you is about understanding the no-cause self in a continuity of consciousness, both from one moment to the next, as from one life to the preceding. And Nagasena, he uses the metaphor, it's like an oil lamp. You know, you light one oil lamp with another oil lamp. I'll show you. So we have fire here, various elements in a state of combustion, conditioned phenomenon. And what is happening now? Would you say this is the same flame, or that it is a completely different flame? Buddha Gosa uses another example. He says, now look at milk that turns into curd. Is there an absolute identity in milk? And is there an absolute identity in curd? Is curd completely different from milk? Are they two completely different phenomena? They are there, you can have a milk there and curd there. You know, are they? Is a complete difference between those two phenomena? Is a complete sameness between those two flames, or is there complete difference? Is there absolute sameness or absolute difference? In a stream, in our mind. Are you the same person who entered the door just before? The person you are now? And if not, are you a completely different person? It's just a stream, continuity of stream. There's neither absolute sameness in the stream at any moment, neither is an absolute difference at any moment. Neither nor. There's a stream. No causal. And it's an identical stream, of course, you know. I mean, the flame does not, milk does not turn into wine. Milk turns into curd or ice cream or whatever, butter. It's an identical process. Milk is not an independent identity that all of a sudden, in a magical way actually, could change into something else. It is a stream of conditions that is manifested in different ways, according to dependencies, according to the context. Although there's no agent there, if I'm mindful, I can manage this process, you know, towards liberation, for instance. If I use my free will in the context of the four right efforts and in the context of the other path factors. The Buddha couldn't certainly do it for me. If I were around at his time, he could not have done it for me. The Buddha couldn't do that for anyone. Each person has to do it for him or herself. So this understanding of the stream of consciousness, of the free will, of how we can influence the course of our mental development is very important for understanding the conditioning of our mind and the liberation of our mind. We ourselves condition our mind, and we ourselves liberate our mind.
Can you tell us something about your relationship to contemporary psychology? Are you only speaking from a Buddhist perspective? Are you also taking in modern psychology? In that case, what? I'm not a therapist, unlike Uffe, who is, and I'm really not an expert in Western psychology at all. One can't help but being, aware of some of what's being learned in therapeutic realms. It's in some way, I think, psychology is the Western paradigm for understanding the mind, which is why Vipassana is, I think, so popular and widespread, because even though the methods are different and even the goals are different, it is basically a psychological paradigm. It's a way of understanding the mind. Right? It goes to deeper levels, but it's the same framework. But I don't have any special expertise, except be aware and don't cling. Okay, this goes to the question that came up earlier about possible dangers or not so good effects from meditation, not so much from people uncovering psychological trauma, but as a result of the meditation itself. And the example was given, personally, this talk about oversensitivity to sense input that developed through the meditation itself. Personally, my hearing is getting more and more sensitive after each retreat. No more radio or concerts, no movies with fast editing, or documentaries with handheld camera, as I get car sick. I am not crying about it, as I get so much benefit from mindfulness. But just wondering about this information overload that might begin to develop through a greater sensitivity. It can happen, although I don't think it's that frequent where one really has to cut back significantly, but it can and does happen. It points to an interesting exploration of how we're practicing, because if we find that hypersensitivity to sense input after a retreat, it might be because in our practice we are focusing too strongly on the object. Because when the focus is very strong on the object, overly strong, then the impact of that object is very intense. And if that has been developed over time, when we leave the retreat and go back into the world, we may have that same oversensitivity. So it's interesting in the meditation, and different schools of Vipassana emphasize different balances. So in that situation, as a way of not having that super heavy focus on the object, to give more attention to the knowing of the object, the knowing aspect. And as I think we've mentioned, Uffe has talked a lot about, the stream of consciousness. In every moment, our life is a stream of knowing an object, knowing of a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste. So this knowing an object are arising and passing, arising and passing. The Buddha gave a really interesting discourse about this. He called it the all. And in 6 short phrases, he described the totality of life. So that's pretty good. He said, what is the all? The eye, visible objects and the knowing of it. The ear, sound, the knowing. Nose, smell, knowing. Tongue, taste, knowing. Body, tactile sensations, knowing. Thoughts, knowing of them. Mind objects. Who experiences something else? I mean, it's really quite amazing when we think our lives are so complex and complicated, and only 6 things are ever happening. It's either a sight, a sound, a smell, a taste, a sensation, or something arising in the mind. So you can think of our whole life and our practice as listening to a 6-piece chamber orchestra. It just has 6 different instruments, and it's creating the music of our lives. And mindfulness is just to pay attention. It's just to listen to the concert. In this concert of knowing these 6 objects, in Vipassana practice, particularly in this tradition, a lot of emphasis is given to the object because they're very tangible and it's easy to become mindful of them. But it's also possible just to kind of back off a little from the object and give emphasis to the knowing of the object, because they're happening together. When we hear a sound, the sound is one thing, and then the knowing of the sound happens right with it. Are we together? So, going back to the question, if one is getting hypersensitive to objects out in the world, it may be because in the meditation there's just been too heavy a focus on the object and not relaxed back enough being mindful of the knowing of the objects. And so you could play with this. There's a wonderful Thai teacher, a woman, unusual for Thailand. She's a laywoman, great teacher. So in Thai Buddhism, that itself is unusual. Upasaka Ki, K-E-E. There's a book of her teachings, which, if you can get, it's a remarkable book. It's called Pure and Simple. So easy title. So she talks in a very interesting way. She talks about being with the breath, and at first doing it just as we've taught it. But then she says at a certain point, she's emphasizing this knowing aspect. She says, it's as if we put the breath to one side and are mindful of the knowing, mindful of the awareness. We still know the breath is there, so it's not forgetting it, and it's still connected to it, but do you get the sense of how you could kind of be feeling the breath, but it's as if it's off to one side. It's not literally off to one side, but it's just off to one side, and we're resting more in the stream of knowing. So you could just play with this and see, if it's helpful, and if it's not, you can leave it. But I think that this would address that problem, that people might have of oversensitivity.
I have 2 questions. One is about some years ago I was on a retreat with a teacher from Burma, and it was very strict retreat. This time I was thinking a retreat is like that. So I would like to ask about this difference, because it's much more soft.
So the question was, she was in Burma, or studied with a Burmese teacher some years ago, and it was very strict. And she was expecting that kind of strictness here, but found it was a little bit softer. And just, what about that? Different teachers just have very different methods. And there are different styles. And at different times we need different things. Munindra-ji, for example, was very open. He didn't impose any structure at all, and so it all came from our own interest, and we developed just as individuals, not as a group. We developed kind of an intensive practice because we were interested in doing it. other teachers, for example, like Sayadaw Pandita and some other Burmese teachers, it's really very strict, you know, and you really have to follow, if you want to practice with them, you really have to follow the program quite strictly. I very much appreciated having Munindra-ji as my first teacher. It suited my personality. And he was very open-minded, not at all sectarian. You know, he's very open-minded to all the kinds of teachings. But then at a certain point in my practice, I really appreciated studying with U Pandita. I felt like, okay, I could use a little kick in the pants.
Would you recommend meditation to everybody who is interested? Or would there be persons with certain psychiatric disorders where it might be harmful? I think of clinical depressions, I think of schizophrenic disorders, and maybe other conditions.
Yeah, I think there are definitely conditions where meditation is not helpful, particularly meditative retreats, because for some people, for some of those cases, in individual cases, it might be that kind of individual instruction in mindfulness could be helpful, just as part of their therapeutic regimen, but to come to a retreat where there's silence and not much connection between people, sometimes that's not helpful at all. It's not what people need. And so it's really important, anybody working with people, you know, who have these kinds of psychiatric disorders, a lot of care is needed. This is not the cure-all for every condition. You know, sometimes other therapeutic modalities are much more helpful. I would say it's, for ordinary run-of-the-mill neurosis, this is very helpful. I like how this, the heading of this simple question. Are there any people like Munindra and Deepama around in this time? Yes. Simple answer. Yeah, there are many, you know, there are many people. Many is a relative term, not millions. But there are people who have devoted themselves to practice and to study and are very accomplished. I think it's good to know that, and you know, if you have a chance to meet with different teachers, and especially in Asia, where there are, you know, the tradition is strong, there are many really wonderful beings. This is a 3-hour question with time for 2-minute response. The comment was, each child learns a very specific way of walking, right? So, which is unique, and we all walk in a specific way. How does that fit with selflessness? Uffe was talking about this last night. Selflessness does not mean, let's see if you can follow the English of this, a lot of negatives. It doesn't mean that there isn't a continuity of a pattern. The pattern is there. They're all unique patterns. But the pattern itself is a flow of phenomena within. It's like the banks of a river, right? The river is flowing, but it's flowing in a particular pattern. One river different from another. But what we call river is the flow of water. So we're all expressing the individual patterns, and all of that is selfless. It doesn't belong to anyone. We'll stop now, but one second. It's just to say that this investigation and exploration of anatta, of selflessness, is the least obvious of the Buddha's teachings in terms of impermanence. We can easily understand dukkha, we can easily understand. This is counterintuitive, right? So as you just begin to hear about it and begin to explore it in your practice, hold it just from a place of interest. If it's not fully understood in a week's retreat, it's fine. This takes an ongoing exploration. The beauty of the retreat and the power is there's probably no other place in your life, or few other places in your life, where you will even hear about selflessness. So just let it be a seed, and continue with your own exploration of what it means.